In September 1945, the war was over in May. In September 1945, Igor Gouzenko, a little cipher clerk in the Soviet embassy in Ottawa, defected with 109 documents and a little address book in which there were names, dozens and dozens of names, of people in Canada, many of them in Ottawa, who had been in touch with the Soviet embassy giving information of some kind, or who were alleged, etc., to have been. Now, this was a huge event. The Soviets were still our allies. However, it was a great event. It was a huge event for Canada. At last, Canada had a first-class scandal, a first-class spy story of its own, and this defection of Igor Gouzenko made headlines across the world. It was particularly interesting, if that is the word, because the poor man did the rounds in Ottawa. You see, he defected, and he went to Canadian External Affairs, one official, functionary after another, and they all closed that. They didn't want to have anything to do with it, didn't believe him, thought he was fake, couldn't believe that such a thing was possible in Ottawa. So it was a kind of amusing defection. And the Soviets, of course, the Soviet embassies were furious. And there were so many people who were being incriminated by them that there was a kind of witch hunt. All kinds of people who were suspected, whose name were in the little address book. Nobody ever thought they had anything to do with the Soviets, and there were the names. The government was not amused. Mackenzie established a royal commission to investigate all this. Now, this event was really the beginning of the Cold War for Canada. And naturally it affected us in the international service. External Affairs were in a sense our bosses, so was the CBC. We had this bifurcated authority that were governing us, and we were then suddenly found ourselves engaged in having to deal with the Soviets in a way which we had not done before. It was, in fact, the end of our innocence. And there were quite a lot of people who were quite left-wing in our crowd, especially in the film board. And so there was a little witch hunt, and the CBC had to deal with this. External Affairs had to deal with it. Now, the man, our boss, the head of the international service, our boss, was a very nice man called Ira Dilworth. And he had been an English teacher in BC. And not young, he was a middle-aged man with lovely, elegant white hair. And he was an expert in Victorian poetry, but he'd never been outside the country. Although he did study at Harvard, but he was totally innocent. He had never, before the CBC appointed him, he had nothing really to do with international affairs. He was more interested in poetry. And it was not easy to find somebody with authority and experience and intelligence to be put in charge of these bunch of foreigners, who were broadcasting in languages which he didn't, of course, understand. And he had to take responsibility for this. And he did as well as he could. The interesting thing about Dilworth was that he was had been a friend of Emily Carr, the painter, in Ottawa, and had persuaded her, who was also a writer, to publish some of her diaries and short stories, and was instrumental in her getting the Governor General's Prize. I think that's what it was. Anyhow, he was a literary person, and he was not at home in the world of politics, and certainly the idea of the whole Soviet aspect, he could not deal with it. And when the RCMP knocked at his door and wanted to investigate and ask questions about some of his people, he immediately, like a mother hen, tried to protect his people. His instincts were absolutely sound to protect his people against witch hunters and the police and government and whatever. So, needless to say, in cases like this, the established authority usually prevails. So there were high-level talks. I know nothing about that, but I can guess that External Affairs went to the CBC president or something and said, I think this man Dilworth is a lovely man, very good in Victorian poetry, and a great patron of Emily Carr, but he's the wrong man for that job at a time like this. So Dilworth took this very badly, had a heart attack. When he survived. And he then was transferred, and another man came in, the precise opposite. He was a Canadian diplomat, Jean Désy, who had been in Paris, and he had been ambassador in Brazil. And he was a man in his 50s, and I think Ottawa didn't know what to do with him. He was a tough little man. And he was pugnacious and tough, and I think everybody was a little bit afraid of him. And since he was strongly anti-communist, they put him in charge of us. He was between assignments, and he was available, and he loved it. He loved that appointment. And he got instructions to purge the place, to clean up, and get rid of whatever suspected left-wingers there are. So a different wind began to blow on Crescent Street. We were about to move to another headquarters, the Ford Hotel on Dorchester Street. And anyhow, it was the kind of idyllic, lovely time we had immediately after the war, when things were straightforward. We had won the war, the Germans had lost the war, the Soviets had won the war, it was all straightforward. Suddenly the whole thing became blurred and difficult. There was one very interesting thing about this, which I have to tell you. We had a Danish section. And the man who was the head of the Danish section, our friend and colleague, was Henning Sorenson. Very nice man, looked like a Danish ship's captain. Very Danish, silver hair, red face, nice man. We did not know, none of us knew, that he was then and had been all along a communist. None of us knew this. And we then later on learned what his role had been during the years before the war and during the war. It was very well known to the RCMP and presumably to Dilworth and Désy that he had been cleared by the police. This is what happened. He had come from Denmark to Montreal in 1929, and he was a communist. And in the 30s, he associated with friends, other left-wing people, communists in Montreal. and among his friends was Norman Bethune, the famous doctor, Montreal doctor Norman Bethune. And when the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, and Bethune went to Spain, he hired Henning Sorenson to be his driver and interpreter in Spain, because Henning Sorenson spoke some Spanish. He was also very competent. Sorenson was very competent. And when then Bethune organized the famous blood banks, and it was a huge, innovative job he did, most effective, Sorenson played a leading role in this, helping Norman Bethune pull that off. And after the Spanish Civil War was lost, Bethune came back to Montreal, later to go to China. But Sorenson went to Latin America. And then for some reason, I don't know what he did, presumably he did some political work in Latin America. And then in 1941 and 42, he came back to Canada and wanted to serve, the Soviets were our allies, wanted to serve in the war effort, and joined naval intelligence in Ottawa. And before doing that, he had to be cleared by the police, by the RCMP. And he gave full evidence, full testimony of his story in Spain, his communism, everything. He remained a communist, and he told them that. But he was cleared. He was not a security risk. He was clear, and he worked in naval intelligence. And when in 1944 they started hiring people for the international service of the CBC, they went to Sorenson, and he was delighted, and they made him head of the Danish section. And right through this witch hunt following the Gouzenko episode, nobody touched Sorenson, because the police and the authorities knew all about him, and none of us knew about it until afterwards. He then left the CBC. He went to Fidel Castro in Cuba. He worked, I think, for 10 years in Cuba. And then he went back to Vancouver, and I've been in touch with him once or twice, and I heard that in 1986 he died.